back to Economic Outlook. In my previous entry, I began an exploration of global oil production since the 1960s to help give a better sense of perspective before applying linearization to estimate potential production plateaus. In this entry, I want to expand upon the discussion I began last time by looking at some of the largest oil producers in 1960 and then compare them to large oil producers today. Next, we'll look at the relative importance of these oil producers to one another and examine how this relationship has changed over time. This chart shows only the major producers to give a better sense of scale. The major producers shown in this chart account for more than 3/4 of the world's oil supply, over 16.5 billion cumulative barrels. The original 7 producers all expanded their capacity and were joined by other nations, marking their first major contributions to the world's energy system. Mexico, Canada, the UAE, and especially Nigeria emerged as important oil producers. In addition, Saudi Arabian production more than quintupled from 500 million barrels annually in 1960 to 2.78 billion barrels in 1973. After the embargo, oil supplies continued to rise, reaching a temporary peak in 1979. That year, Iran ousted Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and Ayatollah Khomeini assumed control of the state. The massive protest, which triggered Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to flee Iran entirely, disrupted oil production. Strikes shut down refineries and foreign workers fled the country. In the following year, Iraq invaded Iran, and as the chart shows, oil production fell to 1/4 of its peak levels. The conflict in Iran caused massive price spikes and prompted US President Jimmy Carter's famous crisis of confidence speech. Prices temporarily spiked, and the US government considered various rationing schemes. Eventually, both the conflicts and oil prices stabilized, although Iran has yet to reach its pre-revolution production levels. After the 1979 energy crisis began to ease, prices dropped precipitously over the next 6 years as demand ebbed and producers like Russia and Mexico increased inventories. After 1986, global demand again began to grow, and both old and new suppliers scrambled to increase capacity to meet demand. By the end of 2007, traditional OPEC suppliers began to approach their production peaks in the late 1970s. Saudi Arabia remained dominant, while Kuwait, Nigeria, the UAE, and Venezuela posted significant gains. New producers like Canada, China, and Mexico more than doubled their own output, and discoveries in the North Sea made both Norway and the United Kingdom important oil producers. While these countries' growth in production is impressive, it's important to understand how production shifted from a few major producers to a larger set of nations as production in the United States peaked and entered decline. One way to view this shift is to examine relative oil production among this set of major producers. This next chart shows the same oil production seen as a total of the group's cumulative production. This shows which states gained or lost importance relative to each other. As previously discussed, the United States was the world's dominant producer for the early half of the 20th century, but gradually diminished as its supplies peaked and other countries increased production. Beginning in 1960, the United States produced almost 40% of this group's total oil. By the end of 2007, it had just a 10% share. Other countries' gains and losses are just as impressive. Norway and the United Kingdom both emerged as major oil stakeholders in the 80s and 90s, but both are now losing ground to other producers. Russia also experienced a unique rise in prominence up through 1984 when it contributed 20% of the total output, the highest of any single nation. However, production declines have eroded its share. And gains by smaller producers are especially impressive. Mexico, China, Nigeria, and the UAE were dwarfed by their larger counterparts in 1960. Today, they combine to make up more than 1/4 of the world's total production. The most important lesson from this graph is that the decline in US oil dominance led a plurality of smaller producers to meet the world's energy needs. But prior to 1986, the oil industry was dominated by a group of large producers, while smaller nations began to establish themselves and develop infrastructure and identify reserves. After 1986, these countries' cumulative production increased by more than 5 billion barrels annually in 2006. In this time, Saudi Arabia, and to a much smaller extent Iran, were the only original major producers to increase their actual annual production. As the relative production graph reveals, the vast majority of growth came from smaller producers' gains. The world's shift to global production from a variety of producers has important implications for our understanding of oil depletion around the world. The oil crises of 1973 and 1979 fueled a boom in exploration in areas outside of OPEC. The majority of these investments have offset both real and relative declines in production in the United States, Russia, and other major suppliers, especially since 1986. We've also seen major new discoveries, most notably those in the North Sea, which appear to already be in decline in both real and relative importance. Finally, Saudi Arabia has become an even more important supplier than it was in the late 1960s and early 70s. It's dominant in both pure production and relative to its peers. In my next entry, I'll use this broadened understanding of global oil production to apply linearization to a set of countries and regions to help determine when the world may see production plateaus. I'll see you next time on Economic Outlook, and as always, thanks for listening.